Welcome, everyone, to tonight's event. We're glad you're all here, and we are eager to get started. Can we trust the New Testament? Have there been changes to the text of the Bible? Some believe that the text has been corrupted and is therefore unreliable. But is this true? Our speaker this evening will address these questions and more. My name is Abraham Schwartzrock. I'm a junior majoring in physics and a student member of the Ratio Christi chapter here at SDSU. And I'd like to welcome you to our 4th annual Veritas Forum at South Dakota State University. Welcome. Along with the lead organizer, Ratio Christi, we have the Navigators, Crew, InterVarsity, and Equip campus ministries as tonight's Veritas Forum partnering student groups. We're furthermore glad to host this fall's forum in conjunction with the SDSU Department of History, Political Science, Philosophy, and Religion. If you saw, I had to check the title, check my notes halfway through the title, that's how you know it's a Department of Substance. This evening's Veritas Forum is a lecture to be followed by a moderated Q&A. We invite everyone to ask questions at the mics after the lecture. A word on the Veritas Forum. Veritas is Latin for truth, so we're here tonight for a real discussion connecting truth to our hardest questions and our deepest beliefs. For those here who would identify as Christians, we hope that you will be challenged to examine your faith with intellectual honesty and rigor. For those who come from another faith perspective, we hope that you likewise will be challenged by tonight's lecture and will examine your faith perspective with intellectual honesty and rigor as well. The Veritas planning team aims to create events that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging to people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we ask for your help with that. Please note the survey card of an appearance very similar to this, which should have been placed on your seat unless you're one of the unfortunate few for whom these ran out in the back. You might scour for an open seat, which probably has one later, because we'd love to get your feedback. We'll provide a time to fill these out, and that will be towards the end of the event tonight, and ushers will proceed to collect them. Lastly, if you want to continue the discussion after tonight's forum, you are invited to stick around for snacks and drinks out in the foyer. You can also visit our Ratio Christi meeting this next Monday, not Native American Day. We will meet every Monday that there are classes at 5:30 p.m. in Daktronics Engineering Hall, room number 317. We'd love to have you join us this semester as we are discussing topics related to those of this event. The title of this semester's focus is The Historical Argument for Jesus. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Burhow, for this night's proceedings. Dr. Burhow is actively engaged with our lead sponsor, Ratio Christi, and is a lecturer in philosophy and religion here at SDSU. His research is primarily in the philosophy of religion and science, and he is the author of a book entitled Dysteleology, a philosophical assessment of the problem of suboptimal design in biology. I can see your faces are simply alight and dancing with wonderstruck curiosity at the prospect of being regaled by that work. So I'll inform you that it's scheduled to be published with the publisher Pickwick in 2019. You know, maybe this is more of a stern crowd and they're biting at the bit to give him a harsh and scathing critique. Either way, be on the lookout in 2019 for that work. Would you please join me in welcoming Mike Burhow as he introduces tonight's speaker.
Wow, I don't know if I should thank you or not, but thank you for that introduction. I'm also happy to be here tonight, and I'm glad that all of you have been able to come and join us. I will be helping moderate tonight's discussion. That's my role. And so one of the things I want to encourage all of you to do is, as you're listening to Dr. Wallace, to be taking notes and thinking of questions that you could ask him after his lecture. As Abe mentioned, there will be a way to submit your questions via your phones, but there's also going to be mics going around during the Q&A time, so if you want to ask questions in person, you can do that as well. Tonight's speaker is the founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. He has traveled to 35 countries and has examined hundreds of thousands of pages of unique, handwritten manuscripts in dozens of libraries, monasteries, and private collections throughout the world. He is also the senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, where he has served for more than 30 years. He has written, co-authored, or contributed to more than 36 books, and has been a consultant for several different Bible translations. His exegetical syntax of the New Testament is the Standard, Intermediate, Advanced New Testament Greek Grammar in the English-speaking world, and this grammar has been translated into more than a half a dozen languages. We are very glad that he has been able to join us this evening. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Wallace.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening. This is a good-sized crowd. Is it still raining outside? I can't believe you guys came out in such cold weather. It was 90 degrees when I left Dallas this morning, and I prefer that kind of weather over what you have here. The topic that I'll be speaking about is how badly was the New Testament corrupted. It's not a question of whether it was corrupted, but it's a question of how much it was corrupted and how badly it was corrupted. This is something we'll get into in quite a few details. I tend to give in my lectures a long preface that takes about 90% of the time, and then I get into the substantive points in the last 3 minutes. So just hang on, you'll get there at some point. I want to begin by telling you the story about a young man named Andrew, Brother Andrew. He was at what they would consider the equivalent of a seminary or a theological institute in the 9th century in central England. And as he was studying there, preparing to go to a monastery, his professor, his advisor, said, Andrew is a little bit difficult. He was probably like a lot of the engineering students here, he was anal. And did I say something about Abe? I didn't mean that. Where is he? Oh, there you are. What's your major again? Physics. It's close enough. Okay. So Brother Andrew was a detailed-oriented person, and when he got finished with his theological education, the professor wrote a note, a recommendation letter to go to the abbot of the monastery where he would serve for the rest of his life. And so when he got there, and this is how letters of recommendation used to be done, is that the person who was being recommended would actually be carrying the letter, and the letter would, of course, be sealed with wax so that person would not be able to open it. And so he brings it to the abbot, and the abbot reads this note from the professor. And it essentially says, this man is peculiar, he's very anal, 9th century English, of course, but he is one that you need to assign to doing some of the most detailed and monotonous work that nobody else would be interested in doing. So the abbot sized him up and he said, Brother Andrew, I have just the job for you. I want you to take some of our in-house legal documents on how we conduct this monastery and copy them out. We've got 3 copies right here. We'd like you to compare them and make a new copy. So he started this, and about 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the abbot's door. Holy Father, I see some discrepancies in these manuscripts. Have you got some older ones that I can compare? And so the abbot thought, well, yes, we do. They haven't been seen in some time, but I can take you to another part of the library, and you can see some of these older manuscripts. And so he looked at those, and about 20 minutes later, there's another knock at the door. And Andrew says, Holy Father, there's still some discrepancies here. Do you have some older ones that I could look at? And these are the bylaws that they followed in how they conducted themselves at this monastery. And so the abbot sized him up and he said, you know, young man, I'm going to take you to a place that I've never taken any of the current monks to before. But I'm going to trust you to take care of these documents. So he goes down this labyrinthian path that's subterranean in the library through several locked doors and takes him to the room where the original manuscripts of this particular monastery were. And Brother Andrew starts copying out the actual original document and makes a copy of it. And about 10 minutes later, there were about 20 different hands pounding on the abbot's door. The abbot opens the door, and it's all the rest of the monks. And they said, Holy Father, this new monk has gone berserk. He's down there on the table, and he's weeping and gnashing his teeth, and he's pounding on the table. You got to come see him quickly. So they all scurry down and see Brother Andrew. And Andrew's saying, they left out the letter R. How could they do that? They left out the R. And the abbot thought, my gosh, this guy really is anal. And then Andrew said, the word is supposed to be celebrate. You guys still haven't gotten it yet, have you? I think we have some Indus here. Indies, undies, is that what you want to call them? Undies? North Dakota University, undies, underwear, whatever. Anybody from North Dakota here? Okay, I'll try to tell my jokes more slowly for you then. All right, the North Dakota bison, right? Okay, undies. Well, we're asking the question, how badly was the text of the New Testament corrupted? And the fact is that even a small error can have some rather large implications. So I want to start with some quotations from various scholars, and we'll start with Dan Brown, the great scholar who wrote Da Vinci Code, and what he has to say about the Bible. He has Sir Lee Teabing say the Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Well, we've all heard that. Many of you have said that. The Bible has been translated and retranslated so many times, how can we possibly get back to the original text? Well, it's not just Dan Brown who says this in a novel, but Kurt Eichenwald, who is a Dallas native, wrote in December 23rd, 2014 in Newsweek, which was a decent journal before. He wrote, "The Bible's so misunderstood, it's a sin." And here's what he has to say. These journals, magazines, television shows, interviews on the radio, this kind of thing about the Christian faith, where it's an attack on the Christian faith, always seem to come out right around Christmas and Easter, the two times when Christians are thinking more about what they believe than at other times, and so the media tends to try to dissuade them from that opinion. So in the section, Playing Telephone with the Word of God, again, this was in Newsweek, Eichenwald says, no television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope. Neither have I. Well, probably all of that is true so far. And neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation. A translation of translations of translations, of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on, hundreds of times. This sounds perhaps like a bit of an exaggeration to me. And the reality is that what Eichenwald did was he was playing telephone with the scholarly material that he had and didn't read it carefully and ended up doing the telephone game with the sources he had. I'll get to one of the major sources, the major source here in just a minute. But it's not just novelists and journalists who are making claims that we can't possibly get back to the original text and it's totally corrupted. We can't tell what it originally said. C.J. Werleman has also said this. He's an atheist, and his first book was God Hates You, Hate Him Back. Now, I think that's kind of an ironic title for an atheist, don't you think? I mean, shouldn't it be something like nothing hates you, hate nothing back? If he's an atheist. You guys are still a little slow on getting this. And the rest of you just... Anyway. Well, his second book, Jesus Lied, He Was Only Human. Here he is hooked up to a lie detector. And what he has to say is this. We do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. Well, we've heard from a novelist, a journalist, an atheist, and now from a leading Muslim scholar who's a popular apologist in Britain, M.M. al-Azami. And in his book, The History of the Quranic Text, where he compares it to the Old and New Testament, he says this. The Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God but a man, Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man, and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the Scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. If al-Azami is correct, then that means that Christians who believe that the New Testament originally taught that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man are dead wrong, and it's been overhauled many times, but especially in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine became the first Christian emperor and he legalized Christianity. But these guys are not scholars of the Bible. Their primary source, I think, although there could be several others, is Bart Ehrman. And he was here, just last week, wasn't he? Week and a half ago? Bart and I go back, way back. We've been friends for 36 years. I met him in his first year in the PhD program at Princeton Seminary, and we're friends. In his book, Misquoting Jesus, which was his first really popular book, he says a few things about the Bible. Now, what's ironic here is that it's the story behind who changed the Bible and why. It's all about the New Testament. But the background behind this medieval scribe is actually Hebrew, which is what the language of the Old Testament is written in, not the New Testament, and it's upside down. But Ehrman didn't have anything to do with that. He's quite competent in Hebrew as well as Greek. But here's what he had to say. Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. That sounds like Wurliman. It sounds even like Eichenwald. Ehrman, though, is a bona fide New Testament textual scholar or textual critic. He studied under Bruce Metzger for both his master's degree and his PhD at Princeton Seminary, and Bruce Metzger was probably the best textual critic of the New Testament in the 20th century. And that's actually Bart's opinion of him. I think he's probably right. But he also says at the end of his book something that sounds like al-Azami. The more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them. Well, that's really a primary source, but there are others who say something similar. But as we begin this study, what I want us to note is that we have some people that have this radical skepticism that really gets inflated when it gets even beyond Dr. Ehrman. So that they're saying, you've never read the Bible, I've never read the Bible, it's been translated so many times, as if each time it's translated, the older translation is thrown away. Every time a manuscript is copied, they must have burned that first copy. Some attitudes that if they just thought about it for 5 minutes would realize are completely false and certainly not in line with all of the historical evidence that we have. There's two attitudes, though, as we look into this data that I want us to avoid as we begin this. The first is radical skepticism, which we've already seen some quotations from. The second, though, is absolute certainty. And that's an attitude that Christians especially, and I suspect many of you here tonight are Christians, are susceptible to. There's a group that I've seen in Texas and in Ohio, and I heard that you have some here in South Dakota as well, who believe so strongly that the King James Bible is the only real holy Bible. It's the only Word of God, and anything that deviates from it, even in one word, is of the devil or something along those lines. I've actually heard people say, both in Ohio and Texas and no place else, but maybe I'll hear it tonight in South Dakota, with all seriousness, they'll say something like, if the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. Well, when I get that topic in Dallas, I decide we need to pitch the conversation at a level that they can understand. So I say, well, how about them Cowboys? That's where we have to go from there. The problem is that the average Christian, regardless of the translation that you use, tends toward this attitude of absolute certainty as well. You might take to church the ESV, the English Standard Version, or the NIV, or you might use the CSB or the NLT. There's all sorts of acronyms of Bible translations that are available nowadays. And you might think this is the Word of God in every single detail. Now, if you're a Christian, you should believe, most likely, that the Bible is the Word of God. But is it in every detail? Is every word in that translation the Word of God? My response to that would be, of course not. And the reason is because of a couple of things. First of all, we're dealing with translation. No two languages map exactly alike. So you're going to have words that just can't be translated exactly the same way or the same way every time in another language. The syntax is different between two languages. There's so many differences between languages that unless they're very, very close sisters of each other, there's going to be a lot of changes in terms of how you have to translate it to get the idea across. That's why it's been said there's always something lost in translation. But the second reason is that the text that is actually being translated changes over time. In 1984, when the NIV came out, it soon became, in about 10 years, the most popular Bible in the history of the world. The number one most popular Bible before that was the King James, and it took about 270 years to get to that place. But the NIV, I should say that 270 years before another one was published that sort of tried to rival it. But when the NIV came out, it took just 10 years to actually beat the numbers, I understand, of the King James Bible. However, it came out again in 2011. There were adjustments made. There were a lot of changes to the wording, and there were also changes to the text that was being translated. So which one is the Word of God in every particular? Some of you who are Christians have this attitude of absolute certainty when you really ought not to. It's not historically sensitive, and it's not sensitive to what translations are all about. We're going to figure out where between these two attitudes we really should land, and I'll give you plenty of evidence to discuss this tonight. I hope there will be some lively questions. There's 4 questions that we want to answer. So 2 attitudes to avoid, 4 questions to answer. How many textual variants are there? I'll even define what a textual variant is. What kinds of textual variations are there? That is, are they the kind that are the difference between celebrate and celibate? Are they something that's far less significant, far more significant? What kinds of variations? What's the nature of these differences? What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? This, of course, is something that Al-Azami and others have said that, gee, the early church just corrupted the copies of the New Testament that they had, and we can't tell what the original said, but it certainly doesn't affirm things like the deity of Christ in the original. And finally, kind of the capstone question of all of this is, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? Now, if you're trying to figure out where we are in the lecture, this is still pre-preface. I'm almost to the preface now, though. Okay. We have another preliminary question to ask, and that is, don't we have the original New Testament manuscripts anymore? Here's a painting of Jerome, who translated the Greek and Hebrew Old and New Testaments into Latin. He created the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, and he always went around with a human skull to remind him of his own mortality. Perhaps a bit morbid, but I've followed in his footsteps, and I have a skull on my desk at home. It keeps children out. It's a good thing that, I do love my grandchildren, but not in my library. So anyway, don't we have the original New Testament manuscripts anymore? No, we don't. They all would have turned to dust within a century of the final compilation of the New Testament. I'm quite convinced. Why would that be? Well, first of all, they were written on papyrus, the ancient form of paper. And papyrus, even though it was more durable than our modern paper, still could not last forever. In fact, the only papyri that we have discovered that have any text on them at all have been in the driest possible climates, like Egypt or the Dead Sea, some other places like this where we do see some papyri. But in other parts of the world, they haven't lasted. Not only that, but these New Testament books, 27 different books, would have been copied and copied and copied. And so someone coming from Corinth to Rome, he has a servant, and he says, hey, my servant is literate, and he'd like to copy out this text that you've got. I understand that Paul wrote this letter to the Romans. I'd like to get a copy for myself. So while the servant comes and copies this out, he's having exposure to that original manuscript, and more people just did this as an occasional thing. Finally, we get professional scribes that came later. But what that did was it meant that the originals would have been copied many times over, not just one copy going to the next generation, but several people would have copied the originals. But because of that, those originals would have worn out, and I'm convinced within a century they would have all just turned to dust. So we don't have the originals anymore. Well, what if all the manuscripts that we had, though, were exactly alike? If they were all exactly alike, we'd say, well, we guess that that's probably what the original says, but we really can't tell. Like with Muslims and the Quran, many Muslims claim that every copy of the Quran is exactly like every other copy. That actually is not true. I've seen copies of the Quran that are different from each other, and they also have erasures that have been changed several times, frankly, at times. So our manuscripts do not agree with each other completely. Not only that, but there are no two New Testament manuscripts that agree word for word. There are not two that do this. The two closest we have from the first millennium disagree between 6 and 10 times per chapter. You extrapolate that out over the whole New Testament, which would be about 260 chapters, that's a couple thousand differences for the two closest old manuscripts. So precisely because of the disappearance of the original and because of the discrepancies among the copies, we have to do what's called textual criticism to arrive at the original wording of the New Testament. So another preliminary question. I think this is the last of the pre-preface, and we're actually getting into the lecture. What is a textual variant? It's any place among the manuscripts in which there's variation in wording, including word order, omission or addition of words, even spelling differences. All those count as textual variants. What doesn't count is capitalization versus lowercase or punctuation, and the reason is because the original manuscripts were all in capital letters most likely, and there was no punctuation. So that makes it a little bit tricky. In fact, there were no word breaks. They just had to try to figure that out. But actually in Greek, that's not nearly as difficult as it sounds. So this is what the variants are. Let me start with question number 1 then. How many variants do we have? Well, there's one way to measure this that Bart has been fond of saying, and this is one of the times that he actually understates the situation. Words in the New Testament. There are approximately 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. Or if you were Brother Andrew, he would say there are 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament because that's what shows up in our standard text today. So 138,000 words in the New Testament. What Bart likes to say is there are more variants in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's a big understatement. The latest figures are that we have about 500,000 textual variants in the manuscripts. Just the Greek manuscripts we're talking about, not other languages. The New Testament was translated into several different languages. We have quotations by it by people known as church fathers, patristic quotations. Just the manuscripts alone, we have far more variants than we do have words in the original. If this was the only piece of data we have, those of you who are not Christians would be rejoicing. Those of you who are Christians would be slitting your wrists. We have some more information, though, to tell you about. And the big thing I think that is crucial here to get is that the reason we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts. If we had one manuscript of the New Testament, it wouldn't disagree with itself. There would be no variants. But does that tell you what the original says? No. It's just the one manuscript that we'd have to deal with. In the year 1707, John Mill, an Oxford scholar, had spent 30 years of his life, his entire adult life, trying to produce a Greek New Testament that listed as many textual variants as he could find. And his Novum Testamentum Graeca came out in 1707. It was a very large volume with an apparatus or footnotes that listed all the variants of the 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts he was able to look at. Now keep this in mind as we think about these issues. 99 New Testament manuscripts he had access to. We'll talk about how many we have today. He also read what church fathers had to say through the first few centuries and several ancient translations. And he produced a text that I may have a picture of it. Yeah, here it is. This is from the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation. You see the arrow, the yellow arrow. What is below that is his apparatus, his footnotes of differences from that text in much smaller print. Revelation has fewer variants than other portions of the New Testament. But I thought I'd show you one of what he did there. He spent 30 years of his life on this, and he created a book that had 30,000 textual variants from the Greek New Testament. There were groups that absolutely loved this fact, and there were groups that absolutely hated this fact. Those that loved it were Roman Catholics. They said, look, John Mill has produced a text where you guys have a paper pope, and that paper pope is, we're not sure when he's really speaking ex cathedra. He says this in one place, but there's a footnote. Does he really mean that? Which one is it? Our pope, at least, is consistent. And then there were conservative Protestants who said, what John Mill has done is the work of the devil. Why? Because he didn't discover the water. I'm the one who keeps kicking this around. I think I'll leave it right here because I'll probably spill it several more times. It's a good thing I put a cap on it. I have actually destroyed 4 laptops. When I used to have water in a cup, and I decided after I destroyed my last one 2 years ago, I've got to have I have an adult sippy cup with coffee that I use at school, and I have bottled water, and I screw that top on tight. So anyway, that would have been really entertaining if I had done that tonight, but I would not have been very happy, and my wife would especially not be very happy. So where were we? You guys got me distracted. What happened? Oh, okay. So there were some conservative Christians who said that John Mill, what you did was the work of the devil. And frankly, what he did was the work of history, historical investigation, which is always a good thing to do. One of the things that I try to impress upon my students is that we need to be in the pursuit of truth at all costs and go where the evidence leads. John Mill brought him to a place where he said, I'm not sure what the original text of the New Testament is, but I'm a lot closer at getting to what that original wording is by listing all these textual variants. Now we can see the data laid out. Now, Mill died 2 weeks after this was published, which was absolutely perfect timing. When I publish my magnum opus, I want to die 2 weeks later so that I can avoid all the criticisms. 6 years after this, though, there was a man who came to his defense, a man by the name of Richard Bentley, and he was a brilliant scholar at Cambridge. He's universally recognized as light years ahead of his time, and he wrote this book, Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking, where he talks extensively about John Mill's work. And he said, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, back in the early 1500s when we had our first published Greek New Testament, then we would have had no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better condition then than now that we have 30,000 variant readings? It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. So what Bentley is saying is the more manuscripts, the more variants. The more variants, the better able we are to determine which one gave rise to which other variant. Even if you have two from the same age, we can tell that. If they're exactly the same date, we can tell that there's a reading that must be antecedent to the other one. Well, today we have an embarrassment of riches, far more than 99 manuscripts. And here's the latest data that we have on the New Testament manuscripts. In Greek alone, the official number is 5,865. Now, I need to adjust that to about 5,500 because that official number, which comes out of Münster, Germany, there's an institute that's the official cataloger of these manuscripts. They recognize that some of these manuscripts have disappeared, and some of these manuscripts are actually a part of another manuscript that each section got a different catalog number. I won't get into the details, but basically we have about 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts. So if you're at Starbucks tomorrow and somebody says, I heard that we had 5,865 Greek New Testament manuscripts, you'll say, no, that's really the number is about 5,500. You can correct them. And I'm sure anybody who goes to Starbucks is acquainted with these numbers. That's what the New Testament was originally written in, Greek. We're talking about manuscripts prior to the time of the printing press and the first published Greek New Testament on a printing press, which was 1516. The New Testament immediately spread throughout the ancient world, and by the end of the 2nd century, we believe, it was translated into Latin. And Latin started to take off. It became the lingua franca of all of Europe, and so we actually have more manuscripts in Latin than we do in Greek of the New Testament. About 10,000 Latin manuscripts. Not only that, but the New Testament was translated into a number of other languages. Coptic, which is an ancient language, it's Egyptian hieroglyphics put into Greek letters with a few extra letters just thrown in for fun and to confuse modern students who are trying to figure out the verb system of Coptic. I'm not going to speak any further from personal experience, but it's been a royal pain. So we have Latin manuscripts, we have Coptic, we have Syriac, we have Armenian, Arabic, we have Hebrew manuscripts, Old Church Slavonic, Georgian, Gothic. There's a lot of different languages that the New Testament was translated into before the time of the printing press. And conservatively, we could say there are between 5,000 and 10,000 manuscripts in these other languages. Again, not based on a printed edition. These are all handwritten manuscripts. Now, if you had a magic wand and you could just wipe all of these out in one fell swoop, we would still not be left without a witness. And the reason is because of the church fathers. Starting in the late 1st century, we have church fathers who comment on the New Testament. There are even one or two fathers who may have written their works before the New Testament was completed. So they comment on the New Testament, and as time goes on, they write more and more comments. They would write whole treatises on the book of Romans. Origen, for example, 3rd century, middle of the 3rd century, wrote a 15-volume commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. We don't have the full thing anymore. We have Rufinus's 10-volume abridgment in Latin. So we're talking about, these folks simply did not have the gift of brevity. Kind of like me, with my preface, it goes on forever. But they did comment on the New Testament. They wrote theological treatises. They did homilies, sermons, commentaries, all sorts of material about the New Testament. And many times they even discussed textual variants. And they said, actually, the oldest manuscripts don't have this word, but the more recent ones do have it. So they could discuss those things, and we could pinpoint a time and a place when certain manuscripts had variants. So they're extremely helpful. But if you had a magic wand and wiped out all of these other witnesses, you could virtually replicate the entire New Testament many times over just from the writings of the church fathers. And several decades ago, the quotations that have been documented have come to well over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by these church fathers. Now, we're talking just about New Testament manuscripts. What about other literature? And that is going to come after this quick aside. You can see I don't have my presenter's notes up. I'm following this just like you guys are. So if I get lost, I'm gonna blame Mike for that, I think, if that happens. Anyway, a quick aside on the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. I want to talk about this institute, CSNTM. CSNTM.org is the website where you can see hundreds of thousands of pages of Greek New Testament manuscripts, and even some discussions in English that may be helpful. But you'll see some amazing things there, because we have contributed to the number of known Greek New Testament manuscripts significantly since we started in 2002. What is CSNTM? It's an independent, nonprofit institute founded in 2002 based in Plano, Texas. We have two primary objectives: to digitally preserve all Greek New Testament manuscripts. That's 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts and counting. It's about 2.5 million pages of manuscripts. And we want to provide these images free for all time, in order to help determine the exact wording of the original New Testament. Well, in the beginning, there was microfilm, and it was not good. This is what scholars had to use to figure out what these New Testament manuscripts said. They couldn't go to all these libraries and monasteries throughout the world to find the manuscripts. They had to go to places where the microfilms had been done. And there was one location, Münster, Germany, that had done 90% of all the manuscripts on microfilm. This was one of the more recent microfilms they did of a manuscript of the Gospels, and they had to use a reverse image because the positive image was even harder to read. This is not easy to read. Even from my computer, it's not easy to read. You see that little box with dots and blobs? That's a marginal note, and I think what it is, based on this image, is the scribe probably had left out a verse, and the scribe has put a note in his text, typically an asterisk, and he puts an asterisk in the margin saying, this belongs right here. But with microfilms, we could never read that. Scholars that have had to deal with microfilms just ignore the marginal notes because it's too small. You can't read it. So, then came digital photography, and it was very good. Here's a page from Romans. That's not a digital photograph, but from a manuscript that's on the island of Patmos. And then we have one of our early cameras photographing it as well. Same page. And it's much, much easier to read. This manuscript has become so important, it has helped to shape the text of 7 letters in the New Testament in terms of what we think the original text said, because this manuscript was virtually unreadable before. And now with these digital images that we've taken, it can be read much more easily. So let me just give you some accomplishments of CSNTM to date. Since this is a captive audience, I can go on. And in fact, I'm going to show you all 500,000 images we've taken so far. Just sit tight. You know, there's snacks out in the hallway, but you'll get those probably Tuesday. So we've digitized over 500,000 pages of New Testament manuscripts. We're the world's leading institute. Tiny institute. We've got 7 of us doing this work. We've discovered more than 90 New Testament manuscripts. In the last 16 years, that's more than all the institutes in the world combined have discovered. And we've also trained dozens of grad students to work with manuscripts, many of whom have gone on to get their PhDs and are now leading the charge in this whole discipline of textual criticism. So we visited a number of sites, about 45 sites so far. I was going to list a bunch of them, but I don't have time to do that. But here's the island of Patmos, where John wrote the book of Revelation. Whether it's John the Apostle or some other person named John, we're not exactly sure. But this is on top of the monastery that is a 900-year-old monastery, and it has walls that are as much as 10, 15 feet thick. We've spent a lot of time on Patmos digitizing the manuscripts at this monastery. We've been to Cambridge University, Oxford University, St. Catherine's Monastery in the middle of the Egyptian desert at the base of Mount Sinai. the National Archive in Tirana, Albania. We've been to Iași, Romania. We even went to Transylvania, Romania. That was fun. And a number of sites. The Biblioteca Medici Laurentiana in Florence, which is the only library that Michelangelo ever designed. We've been down to Australia and New Zealand to photograph all of the Greek New Testament manuscripts in those two countries. And there's quite a few in North America as well. We've really been in a number of different sites. You're just going to have to trust me on that. Here's some example photographs of what we've shot. And this is VGA, so the quality isn't quite as good, but I think you get a sense that this is pretty amazing stuff. Handwritten manuscripts. Isn't that gorgeous? It really shows how much these scribes valued the Bible. They didn't treat other documents this well. This is another one it says from the Gospel according to Matthew, and it tells you what day, what Sabbath, or what Sunday you're supposed to read from this Gospel. And that's about a 1,000-year-old manuscript with the color still gorgeous. Here's the oldest manuscript of Paul's letters to all of his letters, and this is Galatians at the very bottom of it. This is actually the first page I had when I started the lecture. And the text down there can barely be read. Older photographs of this, it couldn't be read. CSNTM is actually republishing this papyrus and others, 3 of the earliest manuscripts we have of the New Testament, and we are discovering literally thousands of letters that could not be seen prior to digital photography. It's a very exciting thing. Okay, that's enough of my shameless advertising. So now back to the number of New Testament manuscripts. But we have contributed to that fund almost 100 manuscripts. The New Testament, if you were to compare it to the average classical work, what would we end up with? Well, the average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his works still in existence. You stack them up, they're about 4 feet high. So how would that compare to the New Testament? I thought about this, about how can I express this visually? So I thought, well, the average classical work, it's kind of like this podium, about 4 feet high. This is actually a photograph of this very podium. And then the New Testament, what could I use to illustrate that? Well, how about the Empire State Building? And I have to add in New York City, to those of you who are, I guess, USD students, is that right? Because you don't know where it is, but anyway. But that's not to scale. Now I'm going to show you this to scale. Here's the podium. Okay, now you can see it. See that dot? It's about a pixel. It's 4 feet tall. And here's the Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. But it's not just one Empire State Building. So you have the average classical author. He's got manuscripts that stack up to one podium. The New Testament, we're just talking about the Greek and other versions, just like we are for the classical authors. And we're not talking about the Church Fathers quotations. I have no idea how to quantify that. It's not just one Empire State Building. It's 4.5. That's 6,600 feet tall, 1.25 miles high, versus 4 feet high. So you can understand why scholars speak about having an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament. And you can understand why we have far more textual variants for the New Testament than any classical authors have of their works, because we have a whole lot more manuscripts than they do. I was going to talk to you a little bit about Greco-Roman historians and biographies. I'll just touch on this briefly. You could go through and see a number of historians and biographers, which is very similar to the genre we have for the New Testament. And we've got Pliny the Elder right around the time of the first, when the New Testament was written, Plutarch's Lives, Josephus, the historian for Judaism at the end of the first century, Polybius, Pausanias, who wrote a geography of Greece, and we have either no manuscripts or just small shreds of manuscripts for 700 years for Pliny, 800 years Plutarch, 800 for Josephus, etc. These are well-known historians and biographers. They are not just the average classical authors. Then there's Herodotus and his histories. We do have some fragments, but not much, for 1,500 years. Xenophon's Hellenica. We're waiting 1,800 years before we get anything more than a few scraps of papyrus. If the New Testament were in that kind of shape, it would be like saying the first substantial copy of the New Testament, of any portion of the New Testament, more than just a few pages, was written at about the same time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. That's when skeptics would have a claim that we can't possibly get back to the New Testament. And even then, I'm not so sure that claim would be that impressive, because scholars who work with these other ancient texts, they say, this is the best we've got, and we're pretty darn sure that it comes close to what that author originally said. So when you think about the New Testament, we've talked about the number of manuscripts, but how far back do they go? Well, let me talk to you about the discovery of P-52, which for those of you who are older folks, you know about the P-51 Mustang in World War II. This is not an airplane. This is Papyrus 52. And it's a manuscript that was discovered in 1934. But let me go back 90 years prior to that. In 1844, there was a scholar at Tübingen University in Germany named Ferdinand Christian Bauer. And Bauer, using Hegelian dialectic, basically thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You've all heard that, right? You're familiar with that. Like when a father tells his daughter, you will not have a tattoo on your body. And she says, yes, I will. Thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis is she gets a tattoo. But, well, it doesn't quite work out that way for Bauer. But he studied under Professor Hegel. This is in the 1700s, 1800s when he was there. And he decided that on basis of this philosophical construct, the New Testament was dated very, very late. And the Gospel of John in particular was extremely late. He dated the Gospel of John to about 160 or later, AD 160. Well, that's a long time after John would have lived. And consequently, Bauer argued that there's nothing of any historical reliability in John's Gospel. That view, or a view close to that, held sway for nearly 100 years in European scholarship, until a man named Colin H. Roberts, freshly minted out of his doctoral program, was going through some scraps of papyri left by his predecessor at the Manchester University's John Rylands Library. And he came across this scrap of papyrus. The actual size is about the size of a credit card. And on one side, he noticed it was John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. On the back side, John 18, verses 37 and 38. What that told him was that this manuscript was originally written on a codex. A codex is like our modern book form, where it's bound on one side, and then you have the three cut pages, and you can flip it. You know, some of you have seen a book. Most of you probably have not, because you use computers, and that goes back to the older technology of scrolling. But we know that the codex, Christians didn't invent it, but they were the first to popularize it. We know it was invented in the second half of the first century AD. And in the first 500 years of the Common Era, over 90% of all Christian books were written on a codex, while only 14% or so of non-Christian books were written on a codex. It was the first, and I think only time, in the history of the church where Christians were ahead of the technological curve. So, here's a manuscript that C.H. Roberts looked at, and he was able to date it. He said, it's dated somewhere between AD 100 and 150. He sent photographs to the three leading papyrus scholars, known as a papyrologist in Europe, and each one of them independently wrote back to him and said, this should be dated as early as AD 100, as late as AD 150. Here was a manuscript, a small fragment of a manuscript, that told us that the whole Gospel of John was originally what this was of, and it sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. An ounce of evidence is what C.H. Roberts discovered, and that was worth a pound of presumption, or 2 tons of presumption in this case. That's, I think, what we're dealing with when we're looking at New Testament manuscripts. What is the evidence? It may not be a lot of evidence, and yet I'd say 5,500 manuscripts in Greek is a lot of evidence. So We also have some other manuscripts that come early, as many as a dozen from the 2nd century, and then we go all the way through the 10th century, AD 1,900 years after the New Testament is completed. We have at least 967 Greek New Testament manuscripts written in the first millennium. Now, what if you were to compare that with the average classical author? Within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, almost 1,000 manuscripts, as we just saw. Within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0 manuscripts. You saw that for some of these better-known authors. 1,200 years, 1,500 years, we're waiting a long time before we see any copies. So when someone says, well, gee, we don't have copies of the New Testament until maybe we have to wait for copies of copies of copies. Well, let's multiply that several dozen times, maybe 100 times when you're talking about other ancient literature. Compared to anything else in the ancient world, the New Testament on average is about 1,000 times more evidential. That is, we have about 1,000 times more material evidence for the New Testament than we do the average classical author. And it comes as much as 1,000 years earlier than the average classical author. That's an embarrassment of riches. And it is an embarrassment because we simply don't have enough scholars to work on this. Okay, so I said we're going to ask 4 questions. We're done with question 1 now. Has the Bible been, but I also said, I get to the end real fast, so the last 3 questions will be quick. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Of course not. We still can go back up that line and see a manuscript from the 2nd century or 3rd or 4th. We're not just dependent on that last person in the line of the telephone game where it's a game that's intentionally trying to garble it. We have several lines of transmission. It's not oral, it's written, and we can go back and check those lines of transmission much earlier and do the comparisons. If I were to read out a long statement to all of you that lasted, maybe I read for 5 or 10 minutes, and I asked each one of you to write out exactly what I wrote, I have a good feeling that I'd be able to reconstruct exactly what I said based on what you wrote. I would know which scribes did a better job. Some of you leave out whole sentences. Some of you have nonsense. Some of you have no clue how to spell. Others are very, very painstakingly accurate. You'll miss something, but the scribe next to you will get it. We can reconstruct that from these variants, from these manuscripts. Another way to look at this is in 1611, the King James Bible came out, and the New Testament was essentially based on 8 manuscripts. And of those 8, 3 were really heavily used. 100 years earlier by the first published Greek New Testament done by a man named Erasmus. 3 manuscripts. The oldest of these was 11th century, and he didn't trust that one very much because he thought it was more corrupt. He didn't know how old it was. He had no idea how to date it. Now, in 2018, we have 5,500 manuscripts plus, and our oldest go back to the 2nd century. So as time goes on, we're actually getting closer and closer to the original text, not farther away. Okay, that's question number 1. Number 2, what kinds of textual variations are there? And I'll be much faster about the rest of these. But I wanted to talk to you about the variants and the manuscripts. It's such important evidence to think about. Well, I could break this down into several different categories, but I can simplify it this way. Over 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, there are spelling differences in the manuscripts that really affect nothing. You guys did not laugh at that. Where are you from? John, or the author of the 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, was a very creative speller. He spelled the same exact word 3 different ways within the space of 8 verses. I don't know how he could have pulled that off, but my brother was a creative speller, is a creative speller. He one time wrote a check out to me and misspelled his own name. I wonder if that was intentional, because it's kind of hard to cash. But anyway, these don't really affect anything. They can't even be translated. There are so many different kinds of things that don't get translated, difference in word order, spelling differences, other things. And so I have a question for you Greek geeks. How many ways are there to say John loves Mary in ancient Greek? Well, let me give you some issues. Now, if you don't know Greek, you still need to write the answers down because this will show up on the exam tomorrow. There's word order differences. Greek can put it in any order it wants. John loves Mary, Mary loves John, loves Mary, John loves John, Mary. It doesn't matter because Greek is a highly inflected language. You tell what the subject is by the end. You tell what the direct object is by the ending. And the Greek definite article, the word the, occurs with proper names. We don't know exactly why. I wrote my master's thesis on when the article does not appear in Greek. I spent over 1,200 hours writing that thesis. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when it does appear in Greek. These two works could cure the most hopeless insomniac. We have the article in the Greek New Testament is far more common than any other word. 1 out of 7 words is the in Greek. And we still don't know why it's used with proper names. Although there have been lots of theories, nothing has compelled scholars to believe it one way or another. So you can say, the John loves Mary, the John loves the Mary, John loves the Mary, and it's always translated, John loves Mary. Then there's differences in spelling. For example, the name in John, for John in Greek either has 2 N's in the middle or 1 N. Every time we see it, there are some manuscripts with 2 N's, some with 1. Ioannes or Ioannes. Pronounced the same, spelled differently. So how many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? There's 8 different ways. I had to obviously put this in Greek. If I put this in English, it would say John loves Mary each time, and so you wouldn't get a sense. So you need to, I'll give you a little time to write these down so you have the data. It's not just this number of ways. There's another 8 ways to say John loves Mary. Same word for loves each time, and it's always translated John loves Mary. It's not Mary is loved by John. Every verse, every sentence, is translated John loves Mary. And some more ways, and more. I can assure you these are all different. This took me 8 hours one day to come up with this. So I hope you appreciate this. Yeah, I'm anal like Brother Andrew, I know. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing the basic meaning at all. But there's also conjunctions that are often untranslated that go along with sentences like this. And I just picked on a few of them, and so there's some more ways to say John loves Mary. Hold on a second. $384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing anything. Now, there's actually more ways, but after 8 hours, I felt that I proved my point. These are not all the ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Other legitimate word orders swell the numbers to over 500, and a different verb for loves now mushrooms the numbers to nearly 1,200. Bart Ehrman said we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the texts of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. He's absolutely right. And if we talked about these, that would cure the most hopeless insomniac. If we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. It's a meaningless number. What counts is the nature of these variants. What really is affected? And the smallest category of variants are those that are both meaningful and viable. That is, they change the meaning to some degree, and they have a good chance of being authentic. That's what we mean by viable. Less than 1/5 of 1% of all textual variants fit this group. Here's a way to represent it. The big blue box is the number of textual variants we have. And when you hear about 500,000 textual variants, this is the way that most people think about it. But let's talk about the ones that are actually significant. It's that little yellow box in the corner. That's what we're really talking about. I am a member of the Society of Biblical Literature. Bart Ehrman is also a member of that, and he has given several lectures there. I've given lectures there as well. And when we have this group of textual scholars to get together and talk about variants, I can assure you we've never talked about this large blue box. We'd get kicked out of the society for doing something so boring. What we're focusing on are those that do change the meaning of the text to some degree. So let me give you a couple of illustrations. Here's one of my favorites, Mark chapter 9, verse 29. Jesus' disciples were trying to cast out some demons, and they were unsuccessful. So he said to them, this kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. Or did he just say, by prayer, period? This is the only place in the entire New Testament where and fasting may be part of the original text in the sense of it's a command or a suggestion that you need to fast to do something. So maybe if some of you are involved in exorcisms, you might want to hedge your bet and pray and fast, or you might just pray. Most scholars think the original text ends with prayer, but maybe it also is fasting. And of course, just looking at me, you can tell that I agree with the shorter text, but let's not talk about that further. Let me pick a passage that everybody is much more familiar with. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, the last book of the Bible. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Is that really the number of the beast? In 1843, a manuscript was deciphered that had not been able to be read before because it was from the early 5th century, about AD 400, and it was scraped clean by a scribe several hundred years later who wrote on top of it. A German scholar named Konstantin Tischendorf spent 2 years at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris deciphering these 157 leaves, retracing the letters of the undertext without retracing the upper text. Very, very patient man, and he got a great deal of acclaim for pulling this off. This manuscript, codex, it's known as a Frami Rescriptus, has become the second most important manuscript of the book of Revelation that we have today. In many places, it has the original wording where the most important manuscript does not. And they kind of vie for which one. It's kind of like between Avis and Hertz for you old folks who know about how that used to be done. But this manuscript does not have 666 at Revelation 13:18. Instead, it says 616. That was the only manuscript that we knew of that had that until 1998, when at the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford University, several papyri were published, and one of them that was just 26 fragments of a manuscript that was spread out over 9 chapters in Revelation. Papyrus number 115 is now the oldest manuscript we have for this passage. And that manuscript also says the number of the beast is 616. So one of the most important manuscripts and the oldest manuscript of this passage say the number of the beast is 616. I've had the privilege of seeing both of these in the flesh, and it's been exciting. I could confirm it. I saw them under a magnifying glass, microscope, and absolutely that's what the original text of these 2 manuscripts says, is 616. Now, most scholars who've wrestled with this have said, we're not sure. We still think 666 is probably the original wording here. I don't know. Some days I wake up and I say, I think it's 616. That's what I do when I wake up. I'm sure you think about the same things. But other days, no, I think it's 666. Other days it's 315, and I go right back to bed when I'm doing that. So. But here's the thing. Most scholars would say, yeah, 666, that's the number of the beast. 616, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down, you know. How'd you like to be in that neighborhood? I don't know of any doctrinal statement of any church, any theological institute, any denomination that says in its doctrinal statement, besides things like we believe in the virgin birth, we believe in the deity of Christ, you know, things along those lines, and we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It may be an important textual issue, but it's not that important. It doesn't rise even to that level. So these are just a couple of examples. There's plenty more, and I'm sure we'll come up with some of those during the Q&A. Question 3, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Well, I go back to Dan Brown in his Da Vinci Code. And he has Sir Lee Teabing say to Sophie, my dear, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal. That time in history was when the Council of Nicaea met in AD 325, according to Teabing and Dan Brown. Emperor Constantine was the one who convened it, and then he left and came back towards the end of it later in that summer. So what Dan Brown is saying is that Constantine invented the deity of Christ. We saw that when we already read from M.M. al-Azmi. He believes something similar to that it was the Orthodox Church, the one that came out in the 4th century that finally won the battle against the others, that affirmed a view of the deity of Christ that Christians today would hold to. Remember when I told you an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presupposition? Here's an ounce of evidence, P66, and that's the first leaf of P66. Did you see it? I hope you wrote it down. You can read along with me if you'd like. In John 1:1. This is a manuscript dated about AD 200, about 125 years older than the Council of Nicaea. So here's what it says. I'll read it real quickly for you. En arche en halagas, kai halagas en proston theon, kai theos en halagas. Or, you probably know it better as, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What P66 says, 125 years before the Council of Nicaea, is what every single manuscript of John's Gospel, no matter the date or the language, says at this place. Jesus is unequivocally called God. The same could be said for the major passages that affirm his deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, and his second coming. And there are none of these places that deny these things. There are some where the textual variant is, it's not an affirmation, but it's also not a denial. You see the difference? That's a very important distinction to make. So we get to our fourth question. In other words, what theological issues are dependent on this? Nothing essential. Maybe whether you should fast when you're doing exorcisms, but not too many other things. Has the essence, our final question, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was paleographer extraordinaire and the principal librarian at the British Museum for many, many years, said this about 80 years ago. The general result of all these discoveries, when a lot of these early papyrus discoveries were being made, and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the scriptures and our conviction that we have in our hands in substantial integrity, the veritable Word of God. I think that's a great statement. In substantial integrity, we have in our hands the veritable Word of God. But it's not just a guy like Kenyon who says that. Listen to somebody whom you already know intimately because he was here last week, Bart Ehrman. In his book, Misquoting Jesus, in the paperback edition that came out after about 6 months after the hardback edition, they had an appendix. And on page 252, the editors of this book asked this question. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Notice, they're not asking, do you believe these core tenets to be in jeopardy? They're asking, why do you believe? In other words, the way they read his book is the way hundreds of thousands of college students and others have read his book. Namely, that Bart Ehrman is saying that the core tenets of orthodoxy, of the Christian faith, are in jeopardy by these textual variants. He even sounded like he was saying that earlier. Here's his answer. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Page 252, Misquoting Jesus of the paperback version. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. And so I conclude by simply saying, I agree. I couldn't have put it better myself. The New Testament text in all essentials and in the vast majority of particulars is absolutely certain. Thank you very much.
We are going to move now into a time of Q&A, and we're going to start with a 15-minute Q&A with our resident biblical scholar, Dr. James Murphy. Dr. Murphy teaches here at SDSU. He actually has a class this semester, I believe, in the Gospels. And so I saw you over there taking notes, asking some hopefully what would be challenging questions where we can get the discussion going. And then after this time of Q&A, we're going to have audience questions. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that. That was really, really great. I am going to lead off with a question that I asked you about earlier, and so you will have to fill the audience in on some of this.
Okay.
But there, in fairly recent years, there's been the discovery of another manuscript piece, or a is it papyrus?
Papyrus,
From the Gospel of Mark, and you kind of sort of let the world know a little bit.
I did, yeah.
Tip the hat on that a little bit. And as part of that, there was a question of this could be possibly our earliest witness to the Markan text at the time. And so there was a lot of discussion about, might this be something that actually dates back to the first century itself, which that would be huge. That would be huge. But so my question then essentially on that is just simply, was first century Mark really first century? Is that the assessment that we have at this time? What is the fragment? What's its size and its scope? And why was it hyped perhaps as being so significant a find? Does it still sort of live up to the hype? So there's sort of a lot of little questions.
I don't think you're allowed to ask that many questions.
Okay.
You can simplify it to 2. That's your quota. No more. No,
We're academics, right?
Yeah,
That's what we end up doing.
Yeah, you're asking questions with footnotes just like John Mill's text. Okay. In 2012, I did make an announcement when I debated Bart at his school, North Carolina Chapel Hill. It was our 3rd debate, and I was encouraged to make this announcement. I won't get into the details of who encouraged me or why, but basically also officially authorized to do so. And at that time, my understanding was that one of the world's leading paleographers or papyrologists dated this firmly to the 1st century. I know who the papyrologist is. I respect his opinion highly. And so I said, I've got some firm evidence that this is from the 1st century. What I did not know at the time was that the group that was being represented did not yet own the manuscript, and I thought with this kind of announcement that would shoot the price right through the roof. If you actually have a 1st century fragment of any part of the New Testament written in the same century that the New Testament is, that is huge, and that would make a fragment like this worth millions of dollars. In fact, even 2nd century fragments are worth a couple $1 million typically. So that was what I was told. Later I found out that this paleographer had already changed his mind. It wasn't 1st century. And just this last April or May, the manuscript was finally published. It's P137, or Papyrus 137. And it was published in the Oxyrhynchus Papyri volumes that comes out of England. It is a fragment that is now dated to the late 2nd or early 3rd century. Now that sounds, oh, what a downer. It happens to be the oldest manuscript we have of Mark's Gospel, though, still. The next oldest is firmly in the 3rd century, but this is a small fragment. It's about the size of a 6-inch ruler, one of those, a large bandage, something like that. I've seen the thing, and I was very excited about what I could see in the manuscript, but it is not 1st century. It's late 2nd, early 3rd, and it agrees with other manuscripts of later times. I mean, we just don't have those kinds of changes that people like to talk about. You have differences in these early manuscripts. Some would like to say, well, we don't have professional scribes, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit further on this. Okay. This is from Mark chapter 1, by the way. It has verses 17 and 18 on one side, and I think the other side is verses 9 and 10. But there are some who would like to say the earliest scribes were not professional scribes before Christianity was a legal religion, and so they would have been sloppy in the kinds of mistakes they made. But what we've discovered is that whether a scribe is professional or not, it did not impact how careful they were in writing out the actual words that they're doing. There's been a dissertation done at University of Edinburgh that has just been published that argues this. And the kinds of mistakes these early scribes made who were not professionally trained are the kind of mistakes that you get if some of you were to write out, say, the preamble to the Constitution, and it starts out, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion." Now, again, this group just didn't get it. I don't know what the problem is. You all know that that's a mistake. It's supposed to be cucumber, not onion, but so
That's right.
so that's the kind of a mistake that scribes immediately would recognize and fix. And there have been some recent studies about those kinds of mistakes that are automatically fixed by the next generation of scribes.
And those studies, are they just in the last how many years?
5 years.
In the last 5 years, so
Yeah.
very recent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two of my former students have published on this. One got his doctorate at Edinburgh, Zachary Cole, and the other got his doctorate at Cambridge University, Peter Gurry.
Okay. You're much too efficient because you actually just answered my second question
Oh,
by
good.
tackling that. Because I was going to ask about, because you alluded early on in your talk tonight about the early copyists were probably not trained, and so I was going to kind of follow that. So, awesome. Like, really good
Zachary Cole's dissertation dealt with that specific issue. If they're not trained, does that mean that they did a poor quality job?
So there is just as another example, like from 666-616, one of the examples that I'm sure, that Bart talks about in his Orthodox Corruption of Scripture is from, I think it's Luke 3:22, which is essentially, it's the baptism story, right? And so you have Jesus in Mark and in Matthew have Jesus says a particular thing which is alluding back to Psalm 2:7, right? And in Luke, we have these variants there. And I guess his essential argument is that we've got these two variants. Does it make more sense that a scribe is going to change it one way versus another? So in one reading, it reads, this is the voice from heaven says, "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased." And I can't remember if it says, "and listen to him," or something in one of the variants. But in the other, it says, "Today I have begotten you."
Right.
And that would seem like that would be an example of one that does have some ramification. I think I agree with you that overall, when you take the whole scope of the New Testament, it's probably less of a big deal. But if you're just looking at that variant, there's some impact there, right?
It looks like it. It's Codex Bezae that has "Today I have begotten you," and other manuscripts have "This is my beloved son," or "You are my beloved son," depending on whether it's Matthew or Mark. But Codex Bezae is a 5th century manuscript at Cambridge University, and what that manuscript says is "Today I have begotten you," but that comes from Psalm 2, which Old Testament scholars have argued is an enthronement psalm.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that God has adopted Jesus as his son on the day of his baptism. That enthronement meant that this is the time when someone acceded to the throne became the king of Israel. And consequently, it's not talking about God adopting Jesus as his own son. It's rather saying, this is the day that I'm making a public announcement that you are, in fact, the king, the Messiah.
Okay.
So it sounds like it's affecting things. When you probe deeper and look at how the psalm was actually used, then
Do you
it's
think
really
in that
affirming
instance
things.
his argument that some scribe at some point saw that, and maybe knowing the Christian arguments about the nature of Jesus at the time, maybe have been more likely to change it the other way just to try to help a theological camp?
Yeah, the scribes typically don't know Hebrew and they don't know the Old Testament background very well at all, these Greek scribes. So they would not know this is an enthronement psalm, that is the day that someone becomes the king of Israel or of Judah. And so they say, oh my goodness, this looks like it's saying that God adopts Jesus as his son. So we talked about the idea of adoptionism, that Jesus was not God, but he became adopted by God. And they would only understand that ramification, not how it's actually being used in the Old Testament. And so some scribes would change that if that's the original reading, they would change it to conform more with their understanding of who Jesus is. But the reality is they haven't really changed anything, because either way you read it, it's God is saying, you are the Son of God, you are my Son, and it's not a denial of his divinity at all. So does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it does to me. I don't know about, another thing to me, sort of, I mean, we had Erman here, and then now you, and some of this strikes me as more like, is the glass half full or half empty? It doesn't sound like you guys disagree on so many of the fundamentals. It's that it is almost more, it's not just preference, but it's like the glass half full. I mean, do you feel that way about it?
That's exactly right. At one point, Bart said that if he and Bruce Metzger, his mentor, were shut up in a room and could not get out of the room until they both decided on what the original New Testament said, he said we would disagree in no more than about 50 places. So it's not a matter of what text we think is the original that is really the issue. It's a matter of how we interpret that text that we think is the original. And Gordon Fee, another well-known textual critic who's a good friend with Bart, said the problem with Bart's work, Orthodox Corruption and then Misquoting Jesus, is that he turns possibility into probability and probability into certainty, and then he comes up with an interpretation that just seems bizarre. So it's how he's viewing the data that he comes up with a viewpoint that sounds rather unorthodox. But I don't think that it fits with the text very well. Let me give an illustration.
Sure.
Okay, Bart's favorite example of Orthodox corruption is Matthew 24:36, where we read that Jesus, it's the Olivet Discourse, and he's prophesying, and he says, that day and hour no one knows except the Father alone. But he adds, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father alone, knows when Jesus is going to return. Now, there are some manuscripts, the later Byzantine manuscripts, that would be conforming to orthodoxy, that drop the statement, nor the Son. They have, no one knows the day or the hour, neither the angels, except the Father alone. And Erman would like to argue that these scribes changed the text because it seems to impugn the character of Jesus and his omniscience. And so they cut out that line, nor the Son. The problem is twofold. First, in the parallel in Mark's Gospel, Mark 13:32, there are no variants. I mean, virtually every we know of one late Greek manuscript that drops nor the Son, but everything else has neither the angels nor the Son. So these same scribes who would copy Matthew and Mark apparently don't have a problem with what looks like a denial of Jesus' omniscience in Mark, and they would in Matthew. That doesn't make any sense. The other thing is Matthew adds the word alone about the Father, and Mark does not have that. So in Mark you have, no one knows the day or the hour, neither the angels nor the Son, except the Father. In Matthew you have, no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels, except the Father alone. So by Matthew adding the word alone and relating it just to the Father, he's implying the same thing that Mark says explicitly. So there is no difference in the fundamental meaning. And that's his number one proof text for Orthodox corruption of Scripture.
We're going to keep going with questions here, but I want to just make a note, as you're listening to the dialogue, if you do have questions, the text is now on the screen if you didn't notice, so you can text any questions that you have when we get to audience Q&A, but I'll let you gentlemen continue.
Yeah, just a little bit more. So this is sometimes news to people of faith, but we widely know this in scholarship. It's widely held that that the four Gospels are not independent witnesses, like
right.
four different witnesses to the same car accident. So I take it that you hold that that there's a literary dependence between
yes.
at least three of the four. Okay, so there's a literary relationship. Most scholars, well...
And I hold to Mark and priority too. So
okay, the idea that Mark wrote first and that Matthew is dependent upon Mark as a source, that Luke is dependent upon Mark as a source. Most scholars, I think, still holds somewhat to the notion there's a lot of shared material between Matthew and Luke, and so most scholars for some time have hypothesized that there may have been a now lost source that Matthew and Luke also used. Do you hold to that?
Yeah, Q or Quella, source. Yeah, I think there was a source that Matthew and Luke used. Whether it's a written source or an oral source, that's difficult to tell. I think it's probably a combination.
Okay. So I'll get into a little bit more thorny area than with you, perhaps. I mean, you deal with the manuscripts and the manuscript tradition. That gets us back so far. But a lot of what we also talk about in New Testament studies is that there may have been some oral tradition before things start to get put down. And so, for example, one of the things that Ehrman talked about in his remarks was not just the difficulties with the manuscript tradition, but just that there are these differences between the Gospels themselves. So when you look at, for example, there's the centurion that comes to Jesus, and he's got a servant that is really sick and wants Jesus' help with this. Matthew says the centurion comes himself and asks Jesus. And Jesus says, "Oh, I'll go to your house with you." "No, I'm not worthy of that." But Luke tells us a little bit different story, that the centurion does not come to Jesus. He dispatches people to go to Jesus to ask on his behalf. And then once they have Jesus en route, then he dispatches some more. So there are these differences within the current gospel traditions. Do you talk about that in your own classes? Does that come up, or do you only deal with the differences in the new? So, in other words, there's these supposed discrepancies within the Gospels as we have them. That's different than the discrepancies in the manuscript tradition, right?
Right. It is a difference, and you need to wrestle with. First, if you can try to establish the text of the original of the four Gospels, then you wrestle with what are the differences and what are they trying to tell us. As I mentioned in a class that I was teaching in earlier today, that the Gospels are not photographers taking a photograph of Jesus that you can layer on top of the other so that it says exactly the same thing. They are all giving us portraits of Jesus, and each with their own emphasis. They're being selective. As one scholar said, it's impossible to state a bare fact. Every fact has interpretation spun into it somehow. Now, Mike Lacona, whom I understand you guys have tried to get here, he hasn't come yet. He's done some terrific work on the Gospels, and he just got a book published a year ago on why are there differences in the Gospels. Mike spent 5 years looking at the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and comparing the kinds of differences you have, this kind of a difference. Did the centurion come? Did he send somebody? And there's a number of other kinds of things that are just flat out different in how they're expressing something. And he compared it to Plutarch's Lives. Now, this was his idea. Mike's a longtime friend. It's a brilliant idea he came up with. Plutarch wrote the lives of various famous people. And when Plutarch wrote about one Caesar, for example, in one book, and then he wrote about somebody else in another book, he might reference some of the material that he talked about of the Caesar in this other book. And he doesn't say it the same way. He might say exactly the same kind of a thing that you have in terms of the difference between Matthew and Luke. In other words, you'll have it's called telescoping, where you're collapsing the narrative and you're not telling all the specific details, but you're telling that the centurion came when the centurion's representative actually came. And you've got that kind of a thing. So what Lacona did is he discovered that in Plutarch's Lives, the kinds of differences that he made, where he's the same author each time, are exactly the kinds of things that some scholars would call discrepancies in the Gospels. And it's just the way ancient historiography was done.
Different than today.
It is different from today, yeah. Today, what we always say is, we never say you didn't quote me right, because we got all the recording devices to make sure somebody quoted somebody right. It's rather, you took it out of context. In that day, their concern was not to quote somebody exactly, but to make sure that they got the gist of what was being said and done accurately.
So, just some broader questions. What would you like the public to know, our general audience, or to understand better about biblical scholarship, about what we do. And we all do slightly different things. But when we're trying to bridge that gap between the academy and the laity, what are some things that you really want them to know about us, what we do?
I think non-scholars, at least non-biblical scholars, they will look at the Bible as a very personal issue because it speaks in authoritative terms like no other book does. And in the academy, sometimes, in fact, I think too frequently, when we treat the Bible, we treat it as though it's a textbook that we can analyze without it also being a book that informs our lives and teaches us. And so what I would like lay people to do is remind scholars that we are not the authority over Scripture, but Scripture is the authority over us. And at the same time, I would like scholars to inform lay people that you don't read the Bible as though it's a 20th century history book. It was not written for that purpose. Doesn't conform to our way of doing history. Each one of these evangelists, the gospel writers, has a message to communicate. And it's not just a message of here's what happened. That's part of what they're saying to make sure that it's grounded in history, but it's also shrouded in mystery. They are trying to inculcate faith in Jesus Christ. And frankly, the Bible is the church's book. When scholars who are not part of the church are examining it, they're outside of that scope. And I think sometimes they do a real disservice because they can't grasp fully what the intention is.
Okay, I think we're going to move on now to audience questions. And I think we have some people who might be roaming around with mics. So if you want to ask a question in the mic, raise your hand. We will give priority to the questions that are asked from the audience. If you don't want to do that, you can also text in your questions. But I'm going to begin with a question that we already have had texted in. And it's a question about the Orthodox Church. So you mentioned the Orthodox Church, and somebody was asking, are you talking about the Greek Orthodox Church? And if not that, what do you mean when you talk about the Orthodox Church?
That was in the quotation from M.M. al-Azami. And what he meant by that was not the Eastern Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox Church. What he meant was that which rose to become what Catholics and Protestants today and Eastern Orthodox would all agree in terms of the essentials of the Christian faith. There were 7 different creeds that all 3 branches of Christendom would agree on. That's what he meant by that. And that's what I meant in that discussion, in that context. So they got the words right, but they took it out of context.
Yes. Yes. And again, if you have questions, hold your hands up high, and then our mic... so we've got one in the back if you want to roam back there. So our mics will be roaming around. The next question that we have is, why do you think scholars like yourself seem to have such a difficult time making their evidence known / believed to the general public in a more meaningful way?
Well, I think I do pretty good at getting that. I do think that scholars tend to be introspective and not be concerned about the broader implications of their studies. And frankly, I was perfectly content to do my biblical scholarship without relating it to lay people until Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code came out. And then I was asked by a couple of other scholars, professors, to co-author this book, Reinventing Jesus. And that's the first book that I've written that was meant for a lay audience. But it's been something that I'm beginning to learn, that we need to be able to communicate what we're doing for a lay audience so they can see what the significance of this stuff is for their lives too. And at least I'm trying to do that. And I try to communicate about textual criticism. It's hard for me to believe that I could speak for an hour and a half to a group of lay people in South Dakota about textual criticism, and none of you is asleep yet. That's pretty impressive. So hopefully it was interesting, and I think you see that it was very relevant.
Yeah. Excellent. We've got a question there in the back.
Sure. Am I on? All right.
Who's
First of all-
asking this question?
My name's Alan Gentry.
Okay, if you can raise your hand or something, then I can, okay.
The question I wanted to ask was, you argued in your lecture that as time goes on, we get closer to what the definitive Greek text is. If that's the case, then how can we have any confidence in ever reaching what a definitive text is, especially when we look back over the past in the history, especially during the time of the Reformation and the formation of the King James Bible?
Okay, good question. I do not think we can be confident that we've ever arrived at the definitive text in every particular. I don't think we're going to know that this side of heaven. There are places where I don't know what the original says, that other scholars were just not sure what the original text says. But what we can be confident of is that this is not affecting any essential Christian belief. And one of the ways you can tell that is if you look at the Greek New Testament that stands behind the King James Bible and the Greek New Testament that's used today that has been produced over the last 500 years of scholarship, there are 5,000 differences between the two. And yet the doctrinal statements that the church embraced back then have not changed. So no essential doctrine is impacted by these things. There are a lot of things that are impacted. There's an extra 12 verses in Mark's gospel and an extra 12 verses in John's gospel in the King James Bible that are not in modern translations. But it doesn't affect any essential belief.
Thank you.
And we have a question over here.
Yeah. Hello. Testing. I was wondering, I don't know how much you can speak to this, but what would you say to someone who accepts your lecture here and thinks, wow, I'm impressed by how consistent and how much we can know about an original Greek text of the New Testament, but then thinks to themselves, what if the main problems came in prior to that when the New Testament was compiled, whoever took charge strangled out the competing beliefs about really important doctrinal things such as Jesus' deity, etc. Can we speak to that much, or what would you say to that person?
That's a great question. What Bart Ehrman tried to demonstrate in his book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, that his popular book, Misquoting Jesus, was based on, was he tried to pinpoint when so-called Orthodox or proto-Orthodox scribes changed the text to conform more to their, not that it conformed more to their beliefs, but it clarified, they clarified the text so it would fit what their beliefs were. But he actually, in Orthodox Corruption, was not arguing that they changed the essential meaning of the text. So it's these proto-Orthodox scribes that as church doctrine developed, the church, this is a way an Oxford scholar, Alistair McGrath, has put it, is that the beliefs that Christians have had for centuries, our deposit of faith, our deposit of what we should believe, is in fact the Bible. That's the final revelation from God of what we should believe. The church does not have the right to invent things. What we have the right to do is go back to the Bible and see what it says about Jesus, what it says about God, what it says about the Holy Spirit, what it says about all things that it discusses. And what McGrath pointed out in his book, Genesis of Doctrine, is that the church takes these ingredients, if you will, that are the Bible, and puts them together in such a way that ultimately they are able to recognize this can only fit this kind of a model. Let me give a concrete illustration. If you had blind men who were trying to describe an elephant, and each was feeling a different part of that elephant, their description, when you put it together, you'd say, that's just flat out a contradiction. It's not the same animal. But as you go through that and start putting these texts together and you say, it can't have a discrepancy. This is, at least at the core, going to be telling the same story. Then you discover it must look something like this. McGrath uses that when he talks about the doctrine of the Trinity. And I think in the New Testament, the belief that God is three persons in one being is not a belief that the apostles probably ever consciously came to. And the way I like to illustrate this is When you get to the Council of Constantinople in AD 381, where it's the first time we have a doctrinal statement about the Trinity, if you were to read that, or the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and read it to the Apostle Peter, my guess is he'd say something like, that's interesting. I never thought about it like that. Let me get back to you. But then when he gets back to you, he says, that's what I've been trying to say. I didn't quite realize that's what I was trying to say. So the deposit of revelation that these authors are describing about who God is and these great theological truths of Scripture, they didn't fully grasp themselves. And this is what I was mentioning in your class earlier, that it took them some time, I think, to come to believe in the deity of Christ. Not that they denied it, it just wasn't even a category for them to even consider until the Apostle Paul kind of talked about that with the rest of the apostles.
We have a question in the back?
Why would we have such wide ranges of dates for some of those ancient documents? And then are those educated guesses by some of the experts, or do they use carbon-14 dating, or what is the basis for those?
I'm not sure what wide ranges of oh, you're thinking about this early papyrus. The reason for that one is because there's so minimal material that we can only examine some of these letters, and it's hard to read it for one thing, and you just don't have enough material to make any kind of firm statements. But when it comes to other manuscripts, normally, actually the older we can get within a century and frequently within a half century as to what the date is. Carbon-14 has been used on some documents, not typically biblical documents, but carbon-14 is a destruct method. It actually destroys some of the material it's testing. And you can't just destroy the parchment or the papyrus that this text is written on, because that might be much older than the actual ink. Somebody could have a parchment leaf for 100 years before he wrote on it. That doesn't tell you the date of that text. So you actually have to destroy some of the text. And there's not a whole lot of people that say, yeah, go ahead, I've got this old manuscript that's of the Bible. It's probably worth about $100,000, $500,000. Go ahead and carve away a couple letters there. I don't mind if you get rid of those. So you don't have people doing that very often. But the times that it has been done, it's confirmed the dates that paleographers have already come up with. And carbon-14 testing is not an exact science either. It depends on a number of factors as to what the range is going to be. But paleographers date manuscripts on the basis of known manuscripts that have dates in them. And we compare the handwriting and other features that are going to tell us this must be within this range. So for example, if a manuscript is written where the letters are sitting on the line, it's kind of a notional line. They actually didn't use ink, but they used kind of an awl to indent the lines so they could find out where to make these texts straight. If it's sitting on the line, we have firm evidence that that's from the 10th century or earlier or older. If it's hanging from the line, it's from the 11th century or later. And there's a number of different features that we see in numerous dated manuscripts. If some of you know Greek, you'll know what a breathing mark is, a rough breathing and a smooth breathing. And we know that through the 10th century, they used squared breathing marks. After that, they used rounded breathing marks. You know that a majuscule or capital letter manuscript is what all of our earliest manuscripts are through the 8th century. Beginning in the 9th, we start getting cursive handwriting or minuscule hand. So these are firm dates that we can apply. And within that, then you start seeing what's called ligatures, where you have letter combinations well, you have this, for example, in British English, like archaeology, where you have the A and the E, they share a side in older British English. We'd get that's called a ligature, where you have a two-letter combination. And you can actually date a printed book by whether it has that or not. If you see a book like that, you're almost certain to say, this probably comes from England and it's not in the second half of the 20th century. So those are things that we can even date from printed books. You get those things in manuscripts, and there's ways to tell with a fair precision what it is. I'm going to give one illustration. There's a fellow by the name of Kurt Aland who started the institute in Münster called the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, Münster, Germany. There was a man who got a New Testament manuscript from the 13th century. He wasn't sure what the date was. He acquired it in New York City. I knew the fellow. And he and another person who worked in New Testament manuscripts to a degree, spent a year trying to determine what the textual flavor of this particular manuscript was and what the date of it was. They spent an entire year to do this. They both came to the conclusion that it was 13th century, it's just 2 Gospels, and that it was probably what's called the Byzantine text. That's kind of the text that stands largely behind the King James Bible. So they bring this man, or he brings this manuscript to Münster, Germany, and meets Kurt Aland. Aland, everywhere in this institute, I spent one of my sabbaticals at this institute, it says, nicht rauchen, no smoking. And that applied to everybody except Kurt Aland. So he comes out from his office when he discovers, hey, a new manuscript is brought into this place. We want to show it to you. And he says, oh, that doesn't happen every day. So he's smoking a big cigar. And he's looking at this manuscript that these 2 guys took a year to figure out what the date and the textual flavor was. And he leafs through it, priceless document, smoking the cigar. He says, after about a minute, looks like 13th century Byzantine to me. Now, only a guy that had just lived with these manuscripts could make that kind of an assessment. There are few scholars like Kurt Aland. But I'll give you another illustration. The manuscript that CSNT, you guys were supposed to laugh. I thought that was a great story. And it's a true story, too. I got it from the photographer who worked in Münster and was actually there, as well as from this professor. So my organization, CSNTM, purchased a manuscript several years ago, and I dated it to the 10th or 11th century. I was pretty sure it was late 10th, early 11th century. Bruce Metzger, independently of me, dated it 10th to 11th century. The folks in Münster, Germany, independently of both of us, dated it 10th to 11th century. So here we're coming to the data from our own perspective, from the tools we have, without checking what the other people have said, and we all come to the same conclusion. I think that's pretty significant in terms of how sure we can be about these dates. Some of them we don't know within sometimes more than a 100-year period, but others we know within even a 50-year period. Long-winded answer for that question.
We have a question about the Synoptic Gospels. So if there are differences between the Synoptic Gospels, how does that influence the way that you think about the inspiration of the Bible?
Well, I think they're giving portraits of who Jesus is, and I think that I think sometimes the question we're asking about that is a question about, shouldn't they say exactly the same thing if the Bible's inspired? And my response would be, no, they're trying to give us a different impression of Jesus, a different portrait. Matthew is portraying Jesus as the king. Mark is portraying him as a servant, and a servant and a king don't necessarily correspond. So the way Mark portrays him in different places, he looks much more like a servant. Mark doesn't have the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew does, taking it all the way back to David and even Abraham. And so you've got those kinds of differences that are not discrepancies, but it's a different impression of what really caused them to embrace Jesus. And Luke looks at him differently. John looks at him as the Son of God. So Luke is almost man for all seasons. So there's different ways in which they view Jesus. What this is sometimes called is rhetorical criticism. And I have been absolutely fascinated for decades on why the biblical authors speak about Jesus the way they do. It doesn't affect inspiration. In fact, it gives me a much greater appreciation for him. You can't possibly put in these 4 books everything about Jesus. But when you get different perspectives, now we can see some different things that help to enrich our understanding of who he is in ways that just one kind of a one-size-fits-all portrait would not work. By the way, there was in the late 2nd century a man by the name of Tatian who put together all 4 Gospels as one narrative. It was called the Diatessaron, or 4 through 1. So 1 through 4, I'm sorry. And that was banned later on because it confused these portraits, and people wanted to read the Gospels as individual portraits to see what each Gospel writer was contributing in their understanding of Jesus.
Are there any other questions out in the audience? Yeah, right here.
Well, first of all, thanks for coming from Texas to sunny South Dakota. We invite you back in February and January.
Oh,
it's
right.
much warmer. No, the question is, I've listened to some debates, with Bart Ehrman and yourself, and one thing that Bart always says, and I've always wondered if it's accurate or not, is when he says, we don't have the originals, we don't have the copies of originals, we don't have copies of the copies, the copies of the copies of the copies, and I always wonder if that's just kind of a stretch, or I think you alluded tonight to saying that, the parchment that it was written on in the first century,
Papyrus, not parchment.
Papyrus. Would have disintegrated or something. So my question is, something like John that was written later, how do we know we don't have the copy of the original, or at least a copy of the original, not copies of copies of copies of copies?
Oh,
That makes sense.
I think we probably do in a lot of these cases, or at least portions of these Gospels. If you have, let's say Bart Ehrman says in one place in Misquoting Jesus, said, we don't have the originals of 1 Thessalonians anymore, and we don't know why they disappeared. Well, I think we do. They were copied and copied and copied. And so these scribes would have copied that original document and over again. And then the church, I don't think, had a view of relics that the medieval church started to pick up. We've got enough pieces of the cross where we could build Texas Stadium 2 times over, I think. All this relic business was something that Luther condemned. He said, we have Jesus in the Bible, in the New Testament. That's where we need to see him, not get all these silly relics. But these copies that they made, I think the church was far more concerned about getting the good news about Jesus Christ out to people in the Mediterranean world than they were about necessarily getting a perfectly accurate copy. Some of them made more accurate copies, some made less accurate. The translations, they still called that the Word of God. They called it the New Testament. The Quran, the only true Quran, is in Arabic. All translations are interpretations. So there's a different attitude between these two world religions about how they view their sacred texts. So I'd say Craig Evans, that's a name I don't think we've mentioned tonight, but he recently was the featured actor, I guess, if you want to call it that, in a movie called Fragments of Truth. And he argued in an article that he wrote and in this film that the original manuscripts of the New Testament probably lasted for hundreds of years. Now, I'm in the film too, there are a bunch of others are. I don't agree with him on that. I don't think they would have lasted that long, but he was basing it on some ancient Roman libraries where the average classical text might last for 300 or 400 years in these libraries. My point is that the New Testament manuscripts, precisely because these were the manuscripts related to the life of Christians, would be copied. That's their lifeblood. That's the only way they really know about Jesus. So they're going to copy them far more often than if you copy something of Plato or Aristophanes. It's not something that your life depends on. So you're going to get a lot more copies, which means they're going to wear out more often. But that also probably means that the originals would have been copied far more often, not just a single time.
Yeah, in the back.
Hey, I'm sorry I showed up late. I just got here like 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, we noticed.
Yeah, I know you did. I know you did. Well, hey, listen, I have to thank you for your Greek syntax. I bought it 21 years ago, and it's in my backpack still. So thank you.
You haven't opened it yet? Is that the thing?
No. I'm going to make you sign it later. You'll see.
Okay.
So my question is, I'm a Paul guy. And when I study Paul, I notice that Colossians and Ephesians are different in language, especially the hapax legomena is different in Colossians from the rest of it. So how do you deal with the Deutero-Pauline issues within the Pauline corpus? And what does that tell us about early Christianity? That's more of what I'm interested in. And I'd love to hear more about rhetorical criticism because I studied a little bit with Margaret Mitchell at University of Chicago.
Oh, is that right?
So,
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, so.
Wow. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm sure most people don't know what hapax legomena are and Deutero-Paulines. You might know that term. But what he's talking about is that there are 7 undisputed letters by Paul, and there are 6 letters that are disputed, sometimes called the Deutero-Paulines, sometimes simply called disputed. And among those that are disputed are Colossians and Ephesians. Now, those 2 letters are as similar as any two letters to each other, as any two letters in the whole Bible, except perhaps for Matthew and Mark. I think they're even closer than Matthew and Mark are. And yet, there's only one verse that's identical between Colossians and Ephesians, and that's about Tychicus. So it's not that he's going to be bringing the letter. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't look like somebody is going to be a forger of just Colossians and write Ephesians. Because if you have a forger, they're going to grab more than one manuscript. They're not going to make it look just like a bad copy of Colossians. So my own view is that no, Paul wrote both of these letters. But here's an interesting datum. This is far afield from textual criticism. But here's an interesting piece of data. Eusebius, who wrote his ecclesiastical history no later than AD 324, a year at the latest from the time of the Council of Nicaea. And in Book 3, Chapter 15, he talks about the 22 books of the New Testament that are called the Homologumena, or the books that are accepted by all the churches. And then there's 5 books that are called the Antilegomena, that is, they're disputed by some, but most of the churches accept them. Now, his term homologumena, it's a Greek word that has a technical meaning for Eusebius. And what it meant was that there were 5 great churches in the ancient world: Rome, Antioch, Jerusalem, churches like this. And those 5 churches, what he did is he looked through the annals of church history, and he could trace all the way back to the 1st century AD that there was a unanimous affirmation of those churches that these books were written by these authors. And Eusebius discovered that for all 13 of Paul's letters. Now, what's interesting is in Bart's book Forged, which is about how we know that the books of the Bible were not really written by the people that are claimed to be. What he doesn't talk about is Eusebius and the church fathers and the link we have from 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century on, where they say these are the books that Paul wrote. So those 13 books by Paul were never disputed in early church history, but they're disputed by modern scholars. So I guess that's part of how I would answer your question. But we're getting far afield from textual criticism.
But it's an important question.
Yeah, I'm sure you wanted to justify your question because I spent so much time answering. No, I agree. That's fine.
Okay, so we'll do 2 more questions. So we'll take one from the audience, and then we're going to have some time for filling out comment cards. But let's take this question here, and then we'll have one more.
This question will be optional to whether or not you would want to discuss it or not. But I'm concerned about the authenticity of the NIV Bible, and this may be a topic you don't want to get into, but specifically with the word wine in the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of John, where they speak about the variant of the word wine.
What do they say there? I don't recall what it says.
Well,
doesn't call it grape juice, does it?
Just, I guess basically regard to whether or not the variant of the word wine includes in this gospel, in the 2nd chapter of John, of whether it means grape juice or intoxicating wine.
That's not in the translation. You're talking about a note in some version of the NIV.
I guess just the standard NIV version that we use in the Wesleyan Church.
Well, it's not in the text. I mean, they may have a marginal note that says it might be grape juice. That would probably, if it does, I'm surprised to discover that. It may be Southern Baptists who insisted on that because they had a statement some years ago that the wine of the New Testament might not be real wine. But John 2:10 is so obvious about what's being said there, where the headwaiter tells the groom, normally a man puts out his good wine first, and after that, the cheap stuff. But you have kept the good wine until now. In fact, he says, after people have become drunk, the cheap stuff. That's really what that verb has to mean, methusko. And so what he's really saying is, what you've done is you've kept the good wine until later. Why would they put out the good stuff first? Because the alcohol is going to dull the senses, and you won't know that you're drinking Gallo as the second round. So, but the stuff that Jesus made was some primo wine, I think. And we've done some calculations as to how much it would be. It would be somewhere between 600 and 900 bottles of wine, if I'm not mistaken. That's a pretty nice wedding present for this young couple. I wish you would have been at my wedding. So
Well, on that note, this is a great time to fill out your comment cards. So we're going to take about 60 seconds now, and then we'll have one last question. But we'll take just 60 seconds, fill it out as quick as you can, and then we'll have our last question after that. Okay, I know some of you are still wrapping up, and that's okay if you are. It looks like we have a question in the back, and so we'll do that. This is our last question, so make it a good one.
Okay, just
Nothing
what
like
is
pressure.
your opinion on the sort of pitting texts against each other? As in, you have certain texts that are the earliest, but they have a reading that differs from the majority of the other texts. Like you say you have Aleph saying this, and then the rest of the body of the text is saying something different. What is your opinion on go for Aleph, go for the earliest one, or go for what the majority is saying?
So the question he's asking is, do we go with the earlier manuscripts where there are greater discrepancies among them with other manuscripts, or with the later majority of manuscripts where they are very, very similar to each other, although not identical? And that's dealing with what's called external evidence. What does the material, the actual manuscript say? But textual criticism is far more complex than that. We also have to look at what's called internal evidence. And that has two aspects. What is the author likely to have written, and what is a scribe likely to have done? I'll give just one illustration. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 16, Pilate speaks to the crowd, and he talks about releasing Jesus. And he says, "Whom shall I release to you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus, the one called Christ?" Verses 16 and 17, he talks about that. Now, our modern translations have Jesus Barabbas, but when you look at the manuscripts, the oldest manuscript that actually has the name Jesus before Barabbas is from the 9th century. And it's only a small handful of manuscripts that have the name Jesus before Barabbas. However, Origen in the 3rd century talks about this, and he says, yeah, I know manuscripts that have Jesus with Barabbas, but we know that can't be right because no sinner is ever called Jesus, which is not the case. But the point is that a scribe would have a strong proclivity not to put the name Jesus in front of this brigand, Barabbas. And so scribes would have a natural tendency to remove the name Jesus before Barabbas. And what scribe in his right mind would put that name Jesus before Barabbas? And so here's a place where it's a minority of manuscripts. They're late, but I think they have the original wording. So you have to look at both internal evidence and external evidence. And normally what we discover is that the oldest manuscripts have a far better text than the later manuscripts, but that is not always the case, and we have to look at each textual problem as a case-by-case situation.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for questions. I'm sure several of you still have more. I'm going to invite Abraham back up here to close us for this evening.
First of all, would you please join me once more in thanking Dr. Wallace for coming and speaking to us? We are also very grateful for Dr. Murphy for contributing to tonight's event. Please join me in thanking him as well. We further thank our lead sponsor, Ratio Christi, as well as the partnering organizations, the Navigators, Crew, InterVarsity, Equip Campus Ministries, and the SDSU Department of History, Political Science, Philosophy, and Religion. We're glad you chose to join us tonight, and we truly hope you have been challenged and encouraged to pursue truth and understanding in these greatly important and foundational issues. Should you be interested in more of this, Ratio Christi will be exploring this topic for much of the rest of the semester. Ratio Christi focuses on Christian apologetics, and its purpose statement is to establish the intellectual voice of Christ at the university. And this means that involved students bring faith and reason together to establish the intellectual voice of Christ, seeking a renaissance of Christian thinking in the university. We meet, the local chapter of Ratio Christi that is, every Monday of classes, I'll remind you, at 5:30 p.m. in Daktronics Engineering Hall, room number 317. But that information can also be found, hopefully, on the flyer that is either on your seat or hopefully a nearby one. So please reference it there, and we warmly welcome every one of you. Additionally, Dr. Wallace will be available tomorrow from 11:30 to 1:30 for an informal lunch at Worry Will's here in the Union. And you're welcome to join that as well. Also, please linger for the refreshments located just outside in the foyer. And also to ask Dr. Wallace any further questions you may have. I suspect there are some. Plus, I believe, and I'm not sure if this stock is still in existence, but there was at one time some book selling going on out there. We have books available, I believe, priced at $12, as well as DVDs featuring debate between Dr. Wallace and Dr. Bart Ehrman. And I believe those are priced at $15. So assuming that there's still some in stock, have a look. In closing, we hope you will join us for a future Veritas Forum here at SDSU. And I hope you learned something and you continue to think. And from all of us, we thank you for coming. Thanks.